In this video, we're going to take a look at dates and how to work with dates in JavaScript. So the date constructor, when we say new date, we can pass it some different things. If we don't pass it anything, we'll create a date object set to the current date and time, which is taken from our computer because our browser is running on our computer. So it'll look at the local date and time. We can say a new date, and inside the parentheses set a string value to create a new, to set the date and time of the string. We can use some numeric values to create a date object set to the year. So we have to specify, we can specify up to the year, the month, the day, the hours, the minutes, seconds, and milliseconds of the numbers. Notice it says year and month are required. So you have to do a year and month, then optionally you can add the date, the hours, the minutes, seconds, and milliseconds. We can create a new date object set to another date object. It basically makes a copy of the other date object. And we can also create a date object that contains an invalid date. And we'll see examples of all these coming up here shortly. So here's the most basic way. We create a variable or constant called now. We say new date. So we're creating a new date object right here, and it's going to be set today's current date and time off of our computer, and it's going to store that in this constant called now. Optionally, to create dates, we could do things like this. We can say new date, and we, in this case, 11/3/2020 works just fine. We can do 2/16/21 with slashes in between, and we can specify the time, hours and minutes. Here's one, month, date, year, and then the time, minutes, seconds, hours, minutes, and seconds. And those are using standard date strings. They need to be in this format. We can also create a date object by specifying numeric values. So we can say new date, and then we can specify year, comma, month, comma, day, comma, hours, comma, minutes, comma, seconds. One thing you need to be aware of here, though, is months. When you use this way of initializing a date object, the months are 0 numbered. So January is 0, February is 1, March is 2. All right, so when you normally think of the month numbers, when you're doing it this way, you need to subtract 1 because it's 0 numbered. It's not 1 through 12, it's 0 through 11. December is 11. So election day, we could say something like this, 2020, comma 10, comma 3. Remember, 10 is November. That first Tuesday in November is election day, right? So this is November 3rd. Grand opening, new date, 2021, 1/16. This is February. So this is February 16th. Okay. And departure time, these are the same examples we saw in the previous slide. Again, 3 is April. They keep putting comments in here to remind you that the months are 0 numbered when you're using this method of creating a new date. So be very careful about that. So here's an example. We create a new date here, 8/8/2021. It's called the invoice date. And then we're creating another new date based on the invoice date. So it's going to take this date from our invoice date and make a copy of it for a due date. And then if our bill, the invoice, is due 30 days from now, we can add a number of days to the due date to change it. And we'll see some examples of that coming up too. What happens if an invalid date is passed? So if I say new date 2/29, and this is not a leap year, 2021 was not a leap year. So this is an invalid date. There is no February 29th. So rather than storing a date, it will actually store the string inside the date. It will store invalid date. It will just say invalid date if we look at it. Some strings that can lead to unexpected results in some browsers. new date, and instead of using slashes, we're using dashes. 11/3/2020. Some browsers it might work. Other browsers, it will end up with an invalid date. So it's important to do a lot of user validation. If they're typing in dates and we're taking those dates, we need to do some serious input validation to make sure that the users type the dates in the correct format before we try to store them and do anything with them. Here's another example, new date 11/3/20. Will end up being, since we didn't specify a 4-digit year, could end up in some browsers being 11/3/1920. Not what we expected. Okay. We can also check to see whether an object is a date object. So I could, if I have this election day object, I can say if election day is an instance of, so I can use this instance of keyword here, date, and if it is actually a valid date, then I can have some code that runs inside the curly braces. We have some formatting methods that we can use. Once we have a date object, we can manipulate it and print out certain things and parts of it using some of these formatting methods. So there's a toString method. There's a toDateString method, which only gets the date part of it out, and a toTimeString, which only takes the time part out. So here's an example. We created this constant called birthday. It's a new date, 2001, January 7th at 8:25 a.m. If I say birthday and call .toString, it will print out the actual day of the week, Sunday, January 7th, 2001 at 8:25 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time minus 8 hours. So I'm assuming that the person that did this, when they created this date, that was their time zone. So that was stored in there. If I say birthday.toDateString, it just gives me Sunday, January 7th, 2001. If I say toTimeString, it gives me the time portion. So toDateString gives me the date portion, toTimeString gives me the time portion. We also have a bunch of get methods for a date object. So we can pull just the time, get time. We can get the full year. We can get the month. We can get the date. We can get the day. We can get the hours. We can get the minutes. We can get the seconds. We can get the milliseconds of a date object if we want to. We can also set things. We can set the full year to change the year on a date object. We can set the month to change the month. We can set the date to change the day. We can set the hours and the minutes and the seconds and the milliseconds individually. How to display the date in your own format. So I'm creating this thing called the part time, this date object. It's a new date, 2021. Looks like April. Remember, that's 0 numbered. 16th at 18:30, which is 6:30 p.m. April 16th, 2021 at 6:30 p.m. I can do this. I'm taking the year. Take the depart time and get the full year out, store it in this variable called year. Get the month out, add 1 to it so it makes sense to the rest of the world, and store that in month. I can call get date to get the day. Okay. Let date text equal the year, which is what I pulled out, plus a dash. So then I'm going to take the date text that I had here. I got the year. I'm going to add on the month, .toString, .pad start. So what is this pad start to? That's saying I need it to be at least 2 characters. If it's not 2 characters, I want to add a 0 on it. I want to pad the beginning of it with a 0. So if it comes up 3, this will pad start. It's a string method that we talked about in the previous video. It'll take the 3 and turn it into 0, 3. Then I'm going to concatenate on a dash, another dash. So I got a year, dash, the date as a 2-digit date, dash, the day, toString, And again, we're changing that. If it's a single digit day, we're going to add a 0 on the front of it. And we end up, the final date text is 2021-04-16. So that's how we can take the individual items, use string manipulation and some of those methods we learned about from the string object, and concatenate them back together with a completely different date format than the one that's built in. All right, let's look at how to calculate the number of days till something happens. So we need to understand that when JavaScript stores dates, it doesn't store them as strings. JavaScript behind the scenes is actually storing the number of milliseconds that have elapsed since midnight on January 1st, 1970. Anything that's a positive value that comes after this date, any positive value will be after this date, and any negative value would be before 1970. So internally, the dates are stored in Universal Time or Greenwich Mean Time, but JavaScript uses the time on your computer to adjust those. So number of milliseconds. So since everything's stored as milliseconds, we can actually add and subtract things to calculate things using the milliseconds. So let's take a look at this. Constant now equals a new date. So we're creating a new date object to represent now. Then we're making another new date object based on now. So it's a copy of this first one. Now, why would we do that instead of just creating another new year and saying new date? Okay. Well, some milliseconds have elapsed between when this statement runs and this next statement. So by making this new date based on the date from a few milliseconds ago, we're sure it's an exact copy. Okay. So this is New Year, but we're setting it to today. So what happens is we create a copy of this date, and now we're going to go change, and we're going to set the month to 0, which is January. We're going to set the date to 1, and then we're going to get the full year out of our current date, and we're going to add 1 to it. So it'll be January 1st of next year, which is New Year's. So we're altering this New Year date and changing it to New Year's Day for the coming year. Okay. So now we have today's date and we have New Year's date. Now what can we do with those? We can say, hey, from the new year, get its time and subtract today's time. Okay, remember it's all milliseconds behind the scenes. Okay, so now we have the time left between now and New Year's stored in milliseconds. Then we're going to calculate the number of milliseconds in one day, which is 24 hours times 60 minutes times 60 seconds times 1,000 milliseconds per second. Rather than use that as one big number, we're calculating it on the fly. That tells us how many milliseconds are in one day. So we can take this time left, which is how many milliseconds to the new year, divide it by how many milliseconds are in a day, which is what's happening right here. Then we're going to take math.ceiling of that to push it up to the next number, and we're going to say that's how many days are left. Then we're going to create a message. Oops. The message is there, and if days left is equal to 1, we're going to say is 1 day. But if days left is any more than 1 day, we're going to say are how many days are left until the new year. So we're concatenating some things together to create a message. So if today were November 3rd, 2020, it would say there are 59 days left until the new year. And we're going to see some examples of this in a countdown app we're going to look at in a little bit. How to calculate a due date. We talked earlier about doing an invoice and saying, hey, here's today's date. This is when your invoice is due. Maybe 30 days in advance or 21 days later. So we create a date. And then we create another date based on today's date. So this is today's date, and that's going to be the invoice date. And we're going to call that, we're going to take the invoice date and create this one called due date. And then we're going to call due date, and we're going to set the date. We're going to call due date.get date, and we're going to add 21 to it. So we're taking the date part and adding 21, and it will create this due date for us that is 3 weeks later, because 21 days is 3 weeks. So we're using the date portion of the due date to add 21. If we wanted to set it a month ahead, maybe we'd use 28, or better yet, we would use 30 and call it a 30 days net billing. But we can add days onto the dates using this method. How to find the end of a month. Create a new date. We're going to call it end of month. Set the month to next month. So we're going to take the end of month, our current date that we did right here. We're going to get the month, and we're going to add 1 to it. And we're going to reset our month to that. Set the date to 1 day before the start of the month. So end of month, set the date to 0. Pretty simple. Add 1 today's month, and then set the date to 0, which would be the first of next month. All right, in our next video, we will look at an example using an application of some of these things that we've just seen.